Begin the meeting. So share screen. So first of all, welcome to the North Houston Space Society meeting, our April 3rd meeting. And I'm going to go ahead and let's see, just if everybody could be on mute unless you're speaking, that would probably be good. Um, So a few opening remarks, then Greg's going to give us the latest with the recent space news, and then we'll have George Salazar, our feature speaker, talk about the challenges of doing human missions beyond Earth orbit, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. And also, please share any of your personal space experiences that you have or anything. Um, uh, be a good time for all of us to connect at the end, and then we'll wrap it up by 4. So the first thing is we kind of have a choice about the future of humanity. So kind of one stream of humanity's future is we're only on the Earth, making these little kind of weekend trips to places. Um, the other choice for a future is we get the Earth, but then we also have the International Space Station, orbital facilities, we have bases on the moon, we have cities on Mars, we're on the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. Um, we create these huge orbital facilities. We actually figure out how to create generation ships that go between the stars, and humanity ultimately expands everywhere. Um, if you're for the second future, you're in the right place. If you're more of the first future, we hope we can convince you. And so the vision of the National Space Society, of which the North Houston Space Society is a chapter, is people living and working in thriving communities beyond the Earth. In fact, at some point, hopefully everywhere, to the point that uh, maybe we're not so Earth-centric in our thinking and talking, and using the vast resources for the betterment of humanity. So I read a stat one time that said, of all the sun's energy, only about 1/700 billionth of it falls on the Earth. And with that 1/700 billionth, all the plants grew, all the weather happens, everything that we've known has been powered by that minuscule fraction of the sun's energy. So we have nuclear fusion is the future. We already have the reactor. We just need to figure out a way to harness it a little bit better. So how does the North Houston Space Society help with all of this? So I mean, largely we're here to educate the citizens in North Houston about what's going on in space exploration and development, and inspire them about the abundant future we could have. And with COVID and doing it virtually, we of course expanded well beyond North Houston. We also want to encourage students who have dreams of going into space exploration, of becoming astronauts, of starting space-based businesses, or being involved in the future of humanity beyond the Earth. We want to encourage them and to continue to grow their interest and connect them with resources and activities and events to allow for them to continue on that path of actually ending up in a career that actually allows for them to fulfill their space dreams. I think a lot of people had dreams of doing things with related to space, and some of them, you know, had something to displace that dream. But then other people maybe felt like it wasn't realistic, or there wouldn't be a place for them. And for those people that maybe are at risk of being that, we want to make sure that they feel encouraged and have a path forward. But parents and teachers play a huge role in kind of directing where students end up. And you know, space can easily seem like a kind of a niche feature as opposed to something that's really part of humanity's future. I think our chapter can do a lot to help expand the vision of parents and teachers and help them realize that there are going to be many space jobs. In fact, I would say that the 2020s are going to be to space exploration and development what the 1990s were to the internet and the computer. I think at the end of 2030s, what we think of as being possible is going to be completely different in terms of space exploration. I mean, also want to open the eyes to investors that, investing in space is something worthwhile doing. And then also connect with space exploration enthusiasts for fun and community. We went on a tour of nanoracks last year. Hopefully after the COVID's over with, we're going to go on many more tours and have a lot more activities. So if you're interested in this, I encourage you to go to our website, northhoustonspace.org. You can sign up for an email list. Also, you could join the National Space Society, and this would be a gateway to connecting with other people that share this vision. So just a couple of housekeeping notes. This meeting is being recorded. It's going to be posted on YouTube, northhoustonspace.org, Facebook, and other places. And just let you know, you could turn on your video if you haven't done so already. In the bottom left-hand side, you should see this little window come up. If it has a little bar across it, you can click it, and the bar will go away, and we'll get to see you. Audio, you can mute and unmute. Sometimes we've had some trouble with audio, so depending upon what happens, might have to take away the ability to unmute. But at appropriate times, we'll turn it back on. Also, I've been able to chat for this time. You can only chat with the host right now. So if you have trouble hearing or you have a question or an observation, you could go ahead and put in the chat by clicking the little chat icon in the bottom, and then you should see the chat window pop up. And at points, we'll have Q&A. I think the best way to manage that to keep us from talking over each other is if everybody could just raise your hand if you have a question, and then I'll call on you, and we can have you ask your question or make your comment, and then we just move down the list like that. So the way to raise your hand is click on the little reactions icon at the bottom. This little pop-up window will come up, and there's a raise hand icon. And once your hand's raised, you can also lower your hand, but after you get through asking your question or comment, I'll lower your hand for you. So no need to worry about that. So coming back to the agenda, I'm going to pass it over to Greg, who's going to update us on the latest space news. So take it away, Greg.
Thank you. I will be covering the news since the last meeting, which was about a month. As soon as I get my screen up here. The main theme of this particular news session will be Mars, because there's still quite a lot going on there with the Perseverance rover, and in particular the helicopter, which they're about to launch on April 11th. So last month we covered Perseverance rover quite a bit about what it can do and what it does. So we'll just give an update on the rover itself. They have completed all kinds of self-tests. They had done some of that even in the previous meeting. But in the meantime, they were scouting for an airfield for the Ingenuity helicopter. They wanted to go over and make sure it was all pretty flat and so on. They are in the process of deploying that helicopter now, and deploying means basically dropping it on the ground and moving out of the way. And in the meantime, they've been doing a variety of tests, starting to do samples. They've recorded some sounds while they were driving. That was kind of interesting. Those wheels that you see them driving on, those are metal, and so you get kind of a clanking noise, but it's certainly interesting to hear driving on another planet. You can find this on the internet, not too hard. Also, they've been zapping rocks with a laser, figure out, well, typical aggressive humanity going out and hitting things with lasers. Remember, this is actually for analyzing the rocks. They basically blasted with, a laser which is mounted up here in this camera section. It shoots out, it'll hit an area of the rock. When it vaporizes, then there's spectrometers that look at the spectrum from that, and they can figure out what the composition is. So they're zapping for a purpose. One of which is this particular rock. This was just lying around. They thought it looked pretty interesting, so they did examine it. The laser zapping is, you can see the evidence of that where the red arrow is here. I think I can just blow this up. You can see there's a whole little series of little tiny pits there where it was hit. And of course, NASA's claiming that that wasn't there before. No, they put it there. I haven't actually seen the results of what this rock is. There's been a lot of speculation about it. It was a fairly strange looking rock. Where have they gone? Well, you can track this on the NASA website. You can just search on Google for where is the rover, and you'll find that pretty quickly. It turns out they're not really updating it that fast. I think what's happened is, since they're stopping to deploy the helicopter, they just haven't moved lately, and so they're not bothering to update it. But I think the little portion on the left here is where they landed. They've done some driving around. as I said, they wanted to survey the area pretty well for the airfield. And that's what they've been doing. So on to the helicopter. It is quite different in its goals from Perseverance. Perseverance is really there to look for evidence of past life, as well as to scout out resources and so on. Whereas the helicopter is really a technology demonstration, just to show that we can fly a powered aircraft on another planet. No other aircraft has done this. There were balloons released on Venus, actually by a Russian probe. So there has been some flight, but not powered or controlled flight like this. This is a whole new thing. So when we say it's a technology demo, of course, they're hoping it works as is, but no matter what, they're sure they'll need to refine it. So they want to gather information for designing the next generation. This is a pretty serious engineering challenge to design this because conditions are so different on Mars. This will be useful, certainly for future Mars missions. And that, of course, is either for astronauts or for just the rovers. It's also going to have an impact on another helicopter, which is in the future, which is Saturn's moon Titan. There is a mission going there in the 2030s, probably launched before that, but it'll get there in the 2030s. And that's a very different problem there. Unlike the thin Mars atmosphere, the atmosphere there is actually 4 times denser than Earth's. So in fact, a helicopter is a whole lot easier to design from the aerodynamic standpoint. It's a lot colder there, maybe 100 degrees colder, but in terms of the aerodynamics, it's a lot simpler because you spin a blade and you get a lot more lift because there's so much density in the atmosphere. And also there's less gravity. That has more of the gravity like our moon rather than Mars, which is twice that. So anyway, as I was saying about the benefits, of course, you can scout ahead. Either robotic rovers or humans really can take advantage of that. You can explore a whole lot of area a lot more quickly, of course, if you are going by air. And then there's areas that are simply unreachable by the rovers or by people for that matter. It could be up in mountains, it could be down in caves. Lots of possibilities open up once you have a helicopter. And this is developed quite differently than a typical NASA project because it is only a demo. You can take a lot more risk, and there was a lot shorter development time as well. Perseverance has had 10 years to work on it, and they already had a working model with the Curiosity rover, which was quite similar. So this thing, on the other hand, was built from scratch. And as a result, they did a lot of things that people do nowadays. They used open source software. That includes things like Linux for the operating system. It includes software that they use for sequencing of commands and control. They've in fact made that available on the internet. You can run that software yourself if you want to see what what's like to run the Mars helicopter. And also the hardware they used, a lot of off-the-shelf components. They literally ordered some of these things from hobbyist sort of sites. Now they tested it to make sure it would stand up. And there are some military grade things in there as well. But the key thing is that they really just grabbed things off the shelf whenever they could. So some of the technical details, the thing weighs about 4 pounds, 1.6 feet tall. It has 2 counter-rotating 4-foot diameter blades. And this is different than a typical drone on Earth where you typically have 4 small blades. The big thing is you need really big blades because you just need to catch as much air as possible since the air is so thin there. As they were going for 4 feet diameter, you couldn't fit a device, a helicopter with a lot of different blades. You couldn't really fit it all into the packaging in the rocket. So that's why they went with this. So these are counter-rotating blades. There's 2 of them. And what they do then to control where you go is they control the pitch. And so if you want to go left, you basically put more lift on one side and you go left. So that's actually more like traditional helicopters than the typical drones you have. So what's going to happen is the rover, it stored this helicopter in the base underneath it. And it takes about six days total to really gradually get the thing unfurled and dropped. And I'll show you a picture in a minute. But anyway, it drops out the bottom. And then it quickly drives off so that the solar cells can start charging the battery. So they give it one last charge from the main rover right before they drop it. But after that, it's on its own. So these are the solar cells up here on top. You can see it's not really a terribly large array. They charge up the batteries. They will start communicating with the rover via Zigbee, which is an off-the-shelf kind of low-power standard. It's used for home automation, or to put it in a more glorified way, the Internet of Things. It has a range of about 3,300 feet. So the helicopter has to stay within that range to be able to communicate with the rover and hence to send us information like the pictures or the data from the flight. So as I said, it's solar cell powered. They have rechargeable lithium ion batteries. The design life is really only 30 days. They are given the 30 days to do whatever they can, and then the rover pretty much just moves on and it'll just leave this behind. And these flights will only last about 90 seconds. The first one is a lot less than that even. The very first flight will pretty much just go up maybe 5 or 10 feet and come right back down. Then they get more and more complicated and they go on, longer journeys. But they start easy. And if they even get it off the ground and back successfully, that defines success for this mission. It's not your grandfather's drone. You think about the problems, the engineering problem of getting a helicopter, first to even get it successfully to Mars, but then to run there, first of all, you need a lot of heaters because at night it gets down to maybe 150 below zero. You have rechargeable batteries, but those batteries have to provide the electricity to heat the thing to keep it warm. So you charge it up in a day, but 2/3 of that charge is used just to keep the thing warm, mostly at night in particular. And it's running the equivalent of about 3 smartphone batteries. As I mentioned before, the atmospheric density is only 1% of Earth. That's the equivalent of flying a helicopter about 100,000 feet on Earth in terms of the density of the air in the atmosphere. No helicopter on Earth has ever flown that high. Actually, airplanes don't fly that high. So adjustments have to be made. For one thing, the blades spin a whole lot faster, 2,300 to 2,900 RPM, which is 5 to 10 times faster than Earth helicopters. The limitation is basically the speed of sound on Mars. They run about Mach 0.7, 7 times the speed of sound on Mars on the edge. These blades also need to be a whole lot stiffer than they are on Earth. They realize that there's a lot of vibrations that happen, of course, with anything that rotates at high speed. And there's a lot of damping provided by the atmosphere on Earth, but you don't have that on Mars. So they had to make them much stiffer. They ended up using carbon fibers over some kind of a foam core.
Greg, one thing, we have a message in the chat room that
Yeah.
was wondering if there's a rationale for the 30-day lifespan.
They just didn't want to take any more time. They figured that was enough time to, to prove what they needed to do, collect the data they needed, and then move on. Because, I mean, this is not the main mission. This is really kind of a sideshow. It's an important one, but it is ultimately a sideshow compared to the main mission. This thing cost maybe $80 million total in the whole project. That's out of a $2.5 billion project, and the $2.5 billion has to go on. Okay. Anything else?
Nope,
Okay.
that was the only question.
Okay. So, well, actually, of course, everybody would hope that it'll just kind of tag along, and that'd be great. And maybe they can figure out a way to do that, but they won't stop the project. They won't hold the project anymore to allow for that anyway. I know it seems sad, but that's what they did. So I was mentioning they use a lot of off-the-shelf components. One of those is just a standard Qualcomm Snapdragon processor, which is used in your cell phone. That's their main processor. And that may sound funny, but really, that's actually a lot more powerful than the processors that are used on Perseverance on the main rover itself. And the reason is those are radiation hardened. One of the main problems with electronics in space, once you get beyond Earth, is that there's a lot of radiation out there. And it affects the electronics, especially digital electronics. You end up flipping bits. You think you're storing a 1 or a 0, and it turns to the opposite. But the problem they had is that the existing processors that are radiation hardened, one, they're typically larger geometries, they're older technology, and they're not fast enough. They simply can't keep up. What's really needed here is they're doing a lot of real-time vision and control at maybe 500 hertz, and the existing processors just can't keep up, especially for doing the analysis of the pictures. They need to do that at a pretty high speed. So they went for a commercial processor. Now, the downside, as I said, is that it will fail. And it may fail as often as once every 2 minutes. They're not really sure about this. That's part of the purpose of the testing. But yeah, it could be that bad. So what happens? Well, they realized that that's not acceptable either. So they went a different way. They did take some radiation tolerant hardware for detecting problems. So there's a certain amount of this, the processing that's done, redundantly, just done twice. I think there's 2 different sets of memory, and they compare them. And anytime they simply detect a problem, they do what everybody else has ever done in the history of computers. They reboot. So what does that mean? Well, that means the helicopter starts falling out of the sky. Now, of course, the blades are still spinning, so they won't just completely crash right away, but it will start falling. But the good thing is the reboot is really fast, unlike our typical computers here. A few hundred milliseconds and they're back and the flight resumes. So it's very, very different environment and a very, very different yeah, kind of operational mode. So what they've done so far is that they picked, based on aerial photographs and based on the actual examination by the rover, they picked the airfield. And the airfield is a 10 meter by 10 meter square. That's 33 feet by 33 feet. And they have an overall airfield where they will be flying in the flight zone. And this is actually pretty close to where the rover landed. You saw they only went about 1/10 of a mile so far in all of their roving so far. So this is that same landing field, just shown a different way here. They'll take off and land here. As I said, the first flight just goes up and right back down. Later on, they'll be flying more around the loop here. And what they do is they'll be taking some images. So how do they navigate this thing? Well, actually, they're mainly using inertial navigation, which is what's been used in missiles and submarines for a long time. They're also including tracking, solar tracking, to keep track of where the sun is. But one newer wrinkle is the downward facing camera. They're taking images and they're using that basically to make sure that if there's a drift from inertial navigation, they can pick up on that. So, they need to have all of that working. A side comment on that is that you can't use the compass or the equivalent sensor because Mars' magnetic field is not that strong. It's weak and is inconsistent apparently. So they don't really feel they can trust anything resembling a compass. So they pretty much work on, using images. You could kind of think of that as cruise missile technology in a way, I guess, where they pretty much figure out where you are based on pictures that were taken. This is autonomous to some extent. There's a pre-planned sequence of commands. It's not remote control. There's not a guy sitting with a joystick somewhere. The 20-minute round trip from Earth certainly wouldn't allow that in any case. So it is autonomous, but only to the extent of kind of pre-programming the flight path more than anything else. So what is the status right now? Well, the airfield was chosen based on, as I said, based on the aerial photos and the scouting. There were two key criteria for this. One is the area had to be very flat. They don't want to take any chances on the thing just tipping over when they're not too sure how well it's going to work. One way to look at this is this rover has never, or I'm sorry, the helicopter has never actually flown before. It's flown in a test facility where they can match the density and temperature of the air, but they can't really match the gravity. They dangle it from a fishing line, for their testing, but it's not quite the same as actually flying. So it's, it's interesting. So anyway, two conditions. One is they had to be flat. And the other, there had to be enough texture in the surface so that they could use their downward facing camera to navigate. Turns out that's not really much of a problem. As you can see from this picture, it's an actual picture. There's plenty of rocks there giving them all the texture they need. So this is an actual picture. The helicopter dropped down out of the bay, the underside of the Perseverance rover. Bit by bit, it kind of tipped down to one side and then the other, and the legs all came down individually. So this is several days in. If you look closely, you'll see that it's not actually touching the ground yet. They'll drop at the final 5 inches right near the very end of the deployment process. And that is scheduled fairly soon. There will be a bunch of testing that will go on. Finally, April 11th will be the first flight. That's the schedule right now. On to other topics. We've actually had a speaker here in the past talking about space debris. There's a lot of it up there. It's not just dead satellites. It's also the rockets that got them there. The upper stages of those rockets. There's fairings, which are the things that enclose the payloads at the top, as well as miscellaneous other junk. There's a lot of it up there. The European Space Agency says 26,000 objects. 90% of those aren't functioning. So there's maybe only 3,000 or 4,000 satellites up there that are actually functioning right now. A fifth of which belong to Starlink at this point. So there is a Japanese company called Astroscale that is launching services called End of Life Services, and they're just running a test to test out their ideas on this. And this is typical of the space industry. Here's a company that has 200 people. And although they're headquartered in Japan, they also have employees in the US, the UK, and other places. You never heard of them probably, but they're out there, and there's a lot of those kinds of companies in the newly developing space economy. Um, what they're doing is launching two small satellites of 400 some pounds total together. They're launching it on a Russian rocket to low Earth orbit. And they did launch it. In fact, that was one of the launches that we had in this last month. So there's two parts to it. The servicer is the one doing the work. And so you see it has, it has solar cells to power it. It has an arm here for grabbing what it's going to grab on the dead or the, presumably defunct satellite. So what's called the client here, this is simulating some other, some dead satellite somewhere along the line. And it's going to grab it. But the way it does it is using magnets. So the way they do the cleanup is there's a magnetic docking plate, and there's a picture of that shown here. There's two parts of that. It's magnetic, but also it has a pattern printed on it so that it's recognizable. Because half of the problem is finding the object. When you get up in the general area, you got to find it, and then you analyze its motion, because you ultimately to dock with it, you've got to be moving at exactly the same rate. And in particular, tumbling is a real problem. If the defunct satellite is tumbling, you've got to actually circle around it and try to match it up. And this helps, having a pattern they can easily recognize. So they try to match it for docking, as I said, circling it if needed. So the series of tests they're going to do, first they just release it and then almost immediately grab it. No tumbling, really close. And then they gradually do more and more complicated tests. They have ones where they then have to search for the client from quite a distance and gradually approach safely. And there's a notion of safety zones where you spiral in around it, where you're pretty sure you won't crash into it if you make a mistake. Flying around to inspect the client. Actually, their next mission, in fact, is to inspect a drifting rocket, upper stage booster, and then deorbiting. Now they have a mission video on their website, and it shows that all it does is it grabs a satellite and then together they just deorbit. Now that seems like pretty much a waste. I would hope that in the future they have other ways of forcing deorbiting, where they blast the thing toward Earth and simultaneously boosting itself. That remains to be seen. They didn't discuss it, but certainly you do want reusability in a device like this. Now there's a catch to this whole thing, and that's that you have to have this special docking plate for it to work. Well, obviously that means it won't apply to anything that's up there right now. Nobody else has this yet. Actually, the OneWeb satellites that are being launched for internet service, they do have this docking plate, but nobody else has those. Now, there have been others that have done this sort of thing. Northrop Grumman in particular, we talked about it in an earlier news session, has a spacecraft called Mission Extension Vehicle, MEV-1. It docked with an Intelsat satellite back in 2020. This was up in geosynchronous orbit. And the reason they did that was that it had run out of fuel. And so they actually went up there, they grabbed it, they changed its orbit. Now, they didn't use any special docking plate, but instead they used knowing the geometry of the target. And in reality, is you're going to know the geometry in most cases because somebody put it up there and you can look at their blueprints. In their case, they grabbed inside of a rocket nozzle, and almost all of the Intelsat satellites and lots of others have a particular type of nozzle they use for positioning. So that was not that hard to do. But this wasn't tumbling. This satellite was in service, so they didn't have that problem. Anyway, these companies are pioneering what's called in-orbit services, which is just another category in the developing space economy. You have all these objects up there. Somebody has to move them around when they need to change orbits and they run out of fuel. Others have to get things down and get them out of the way. And so these are in-orbit services that are becoming more important. A final story here is just related to politics. Every time you change presidents, NASA and all the space industries, they worry that everything's going to change. The history of the last 30 years says that. Every new president comes in and they change everything around. The goal is Mars, the goal is the moon, the goal is an asteroid, the goal is just build infrastructure. So people have been worried about that. And of course, they try to read the tea leaves. They noticed that the incoming president put a space rock. He put a moon rock actually in his office. So that was encouraging. But there's been more evidence since then that they're not going to change things that much. One is the White House press secretary said so when asked by a reporter. Another thing is that there's a National Space Council that will continue. That had been revived by former President Trump after a 25-year hiatus. It's been very, very strongly supported by industry because it provides a way to really to bring in input from industry as well as from the military and intelligence interests. This almost didn't happen. This was almost taken back by the National Security Council. So that was taken as a very good sign that things will not change. A second thing is that the U.S. Space Force, which was started under Trump, will be retained. It looks like it's going to continue. And the same thing in particular for NASA's main concern is what about the Artemis lunar program? That too was started under Trump. And, as a result, new president comes in, they want to change everything. Well, they're not. They're actually, it looks like they're going to keep it. Now, these are all just still reading the tea leaves. You don't know for sure, but it's looking good. To the point where the former NASA administrator, Jim Bridenstine, he actually said that's the first time in 30 years that we're not just completely disorienting NASA and the space programs in general for a year or two. That's a good thing. He even supports the nomination of a former Florida senator and astronaut, Bill Nelson, who's the next administrator. So independent of politics, no matter how you feel about any particular president, from a space program standpoint, it's usually kind of a good thing that things don't change too much because you don't waste too much time. And that appears that it might be the case.
Greg,
Okay, that brings us.
we had a question about the National Space Council.
Yep.
Historically, the vice president has kind of chaired that council. Do you know if VP Harris is going to also chair this Space Council?
Yes, I believe she is. And she was not notably a particular space supporter, but people have said that she's getting interested. So we'll see. But yes, that traditionally has always been done by vice president, and it will continue.
And also, David points out that regarding the in-flight servicing and end-of-life service, that the pain on the target has to survive beyond the satellite's life as well. Target life was an issue in some rendezvous studies that he's worked on. David, did you want to say a little bit more about that?
Just that, just that, we did studies on having rendezvous with targets that had a cooperative docking target on it, and so that was one of the concerns, was the life on targets and having to potentially replace targets if you were doing automated rendezvous and docking type functions.
Yeah, I don't know the details, but the thing about this docking target is it is passive. It doesn't require cooperation other than having the plate there in the first place. It looks like it's pretty structural. Presumably, the paint's going to fade and everything, but as long as there's, enough, I guess they're assuming that it'll last long enough, and that's as far as I know. The assumption was they're aware of how things degrade in space. They must have accounted for that.
Hopefully, they're accounting for that. They say it.
I would think so.
It was definitely a concern on target life when we were looking at some of those kind of functions.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, at this point is usually when everybody votes for how many launches do they think have happened since our last meeting, right? Roughly a month. And usually at this point, we put in a picture either of a successful launch, or in the case of the last 3 months, a spectacular explosion from SpaceX and their Starship prototypes. And SpaceX continued to deliver on that this time, except that it was so foggy that nobody got a decent picture. So I feel for Nathan, having gone down there and had to look into the fog and take their word for it that a rocket had gone up and exploded. Anyway, so instead of showing a spectacular explosion this time, I'm just showing a picture of some of the wreckage afterwards, while people are guessing how many flights there were. Okay, I'll give it a few more seconds because we need to move on to the featured speaker here. I don't want to hold it up too long. Okay, so it looks like, let's see, we have 12% said 6 or 7, 25% said 8, 13% said 9, 31% said 10, and 19% of the people said 11. Well, turns out the answer was, wait for it, 9. I'll just highlight a few odds and ends out of these. Of course, SpaceX has been very active with their Starlink internet service launches. They put up 3 of them during this period, 60 satellites each time. I had already mentioned the Russian launch that included the Japanese company's Astroscale space jump clearance. Let's see what else here. Oh yeah, the one big one, the other big one is OneWeb. Remember, they had gone bankrupt. This is another company competing with Starlink for internet service from satellites. They had gone bankrupt. They got rescued by actually the UK government combined with a big private company in India. And so they're running OneWeb now, and they're launching satellites again. They're planning on having the start of service in northern areas around 2020, I'm sorry, this year, late this year, and then globally in 2022. So they're going to be pretty competitive time-wise with Starlink. They have 146 satellites up there out of their 648 total that are planned. Their satellites are up a little bit higher than the ones for Starlink, so they don't need to have quite as many. That compares to 1,300 that are so that are up there that are active for Starlink. And they're getting pretty close to filling out their first, what they call shell, basically a set of satellites. But of course, they're going to continue to launch, eventually achieving 30,000 satellites is still their goal. And with that, take any further questions. Otherwise, I think it's time to, I'm already running late. It's time to get on to the main speaker.
There is one question. Do Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic test flights ever get counted in the quiz?
They've been suborbital so far, so no, they haven't been. Yeah, it's too bad. I wanted to say some things about them, but well, it's really sad with the Virgin Galactic. They only run about a test a year. They hardly ever get much done. Really have to wonder how serious they are. Blue Origin keeps doing tests, but they never actually introduce their service. So don't know what's going on there. But anyway, the answer is they've still been suborbital. So until they do something this orbital or beyond, it doesn't get counted. Okay, so talking about the main speaker for the day, George Salazar, going to talk about beyond Earth orbit mission challenges, and in particular focusing on human space flight and how it's evolved, and how much more complicated it's getting to support human missions. Certainly, we go for deep space in particular, meaning really anything past Earth orbit, going to Moon, going to Mars, a lot of challenges there. And we talked about some of them along the way, things like radiation hardening of your processors. All these things come into play. Now, George is just the guy to talk about this. He's been at NASA Johnson Space Center for quite a few years. He's been active in it, 35 years. Right now, he's a technical lead for human-computer interfaces, and he is a display and controls subsystem manager for the Commercial Crew Program. So he's been involved in human spaceflight in particular for a long, long time. He's worked on a space station, space shuttle, the X-38 spacecraft, and I guess he wants to get going. So anyway, without further ado, I'll turn it over to him.
All right, thank you, Greg. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the introduction, and I appreciate being invited to speak to this awesome group. I've never had an opportunity to speak to an organization such as this, and so today, hopefully, let's see if I can share my screen here.
We can't see your video either.
I'm sorry?
We can't see your video or shared screen, either of them.
Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right,
Well,
so I'm gonna go into presentation mode. Hopefully. Okay, so I'm in presentation mode. Can you see that?
See the Windows logo so far.
All right, great. All right, so again, thank you for inviting me to be a speaker, Greg, and I certainly am appreciative of having an opportunity to share my knowledge over the with students. As I understand, the National Space Society is made up of different folks from different walks of life, teachers, scientists, engineers, and whatever. I notice some of the folks that are attending today are seasoned engineers, former engineers at NASA, as well as scientists and what have you. So what I'm hoping to do today is kind of share with you some of the knowledge that I have, let's say, captured over the years, if you will, in terms of what it's going to take to go to other planets. And I'm going to look at it from two aspects of it. Let me see if I can give then kind of a quick synopsis of my topics. And so, first of all, you can see the background, hopefully, of
Well,
Star.
George, sorry to interrupt, but we are just seeing like the blue Windows screen, not the actual presentation. So
Oh,
it
okay. All right. So something happened, obviously. Let's try this again.
yes. Now we see the speaker's view with the little yep, it looks good now.
Okay, so let me go into presentation and hopefully you can see topics.
Yes, topics. It works.
Excellent. All right. So thank you very much. This whole world of pandemics and webinars, it's been a learning experience for me. So the topics, as you see, there's a brief history of human spaceflight, planned human spaceflight missions, challenges, NASA systems engineering, and human systems integration. HSI, that's what that stands for, mission risk reduction process and conclusions. So what I really want to do is where we were, where we are now, and where we are going. That's basically what I'm trying to convey in this presentation. And what are the challenges and how to meet those? And the challenges, I'm going to be basically presenting at a high level, not getting into too much of the details, but basically showing what are the technological and more so the psychological factors that associated with human spaceflight associated with deep space missions, and kind of give you a glimpse of the systems approach to development of complex systems development. I know, again, as I mentioned, some of the folks out there are probably familiar with the systems engineering process and how NASA develops projects. But what I guess I wanted to give you, for some of you that are not familiar with that, is a flavor, I guess, for the lack of a better term, of what it takes to develop systems for human spaceflight and deep space missions, more importantly. And so hopefully you can see the next chart, which is the topics. And the first one I'm going to talk to is a brief history of human spaceflight. Okay, so past human spaceflight programs, and I'm just going to kind of go briefly through these. Perhaps these have been presented in past NSS presentations, but let me just kind of recap, if you will, some of the projects that human spaceflight have occurred from NASA in the pursuit of eventually going into deep space. So, certainly we can talk about Mercury for a long period of time. I'm just going to say a few words about that. The Mercury space program was basically to understand what it took to for humans to operate in space. We didn't know anything about humans and operating in space. The first maybe 15, 25 flights of the Mercury program were associated with mammals, monkeys, rats, and things of that sort, to see the behavior of them in space. But we didn't really know how humans are going to operate in space. In fact, there were discussions about, well, can they digest food? Will the food come back up because of the microgravity? But we were trying to learn that, and that was the Mercury program. That was the Mercury program in terms of trying to understand what it was going to take for humans to function in the microgravity environment. I have to say that from 1961 to 1966, the Mercury program was basically geared toward basically focusing on those objectives and seeing if we could indeed launch humans into space, orbit around the Earth, and return them safely to Earth. Not just the humans, but obviously the spacecraft. And so let's go to the next program, which was the Mercury space program, rather the Gemini program. And the Gemini program was kind of an evolution, if you will, of going from understanding how if humans could function in space to living and working in space. The Gemini program was kind of geared for a 14-day mission, which was way beyond which Mercury program was. Mercury program was for a day or so, and also looking at the opportunity to see if we could rendezvous and dock with other spacecrafts in space. That was critical for the Apollo program. And so the Gemini was kind of set the stage for, let's say, understanding if we could rendezvous and dock with other spacecraft vehicles. Also, Gemini was the beginnings, if you will, of flight computers. Okay, so in the Mercury program, there were no flight computers. A lot of the computations were done on Earth, and they were transmitted uplink to the Mercury space capsules, for rendezvous, rather for the orbital mechanics, if you will. But Gemini, because of loss of communications, or they cause loss of signal, LOS, was that we needed to have a computer on board for doing the guidance and navigation. And so Gemini was the first opportunity for, let's say, development of a onboard computer system for a spacecraft, our human spacecraft. The first one that was developed by, let's see, it was IBM of Federal Systems. I think they were out of Owego, New York. And then let's go on to the next program, which was obviously the Apollo program, which it was it was a big hit around the world. I mean, this is this was the program that basically landed humans on another planet or terrestrial body, if you will. And of course, the Apollo program was in the intent of it was to provide scientific exploration of the moon and prove that humans could live and work in space, and expand our knowledge and understanding of what it took to operate on another lunar surface. And I'll say a little more about that later, but obviously we did not spend a whole lot of time on the moon. There were a total of 6 missions, a total of 12 astronauts that were basically landed on the moon and did work in operated different equipment on the moon. And then let's go on to Skylab. Skylab was actually the first, let's call it USA space station, and that occurred somewhere in the 1973, 1974 time frame. And it was basically, it was to prove that humans could operate and live and work in space for a long duration of time. Certainly for the moon program, we didn't really operate, or rather have humans in space for a long period of time. The Space Lab was an opportunity to expand that. We had a total of 9 astronauts, if I recall correctly, that lived and worked and operated in the Space Lab for a total of roughly about 171 days. Let me do say one thing about the evolution of complexity of the human interface, because we went from the Mercury program, which had about 55 displays and control switches, to Mercury, which went around to about 200, 250 displays and controls. The Apollo space program that went to about 700 100 displays and controls. The lunar module was roughly about somewhere in the vicinity of 350 displays and controls. Now let's turn our attention to the space shuttle program. Interesting enough, the space shuttle program was certainly instrumental in the assembly of the space station. But interesting enough, the space shuttle was a very complicated machine given the technology at that time. It launched like a vehicle, it orbited like a satellite, but it also returned to the Earth like an atmospheric, let's call it a space plane, if you will. And certainly, you know, the space shuttle, because of the payload bay, was able to retrieve satellites, repair satellites like the Hubble Space Telescope, upgrade the Hubble Space Telescope, some of the Intel satellites as well. So the space shuttle was somewhat of a workhorse, but a very complicated machine, given, again, 70s technology. It had 5 computers. It did quite a impressive, complex, let's call it fault-tolerant parallel processing. The space shuttle without these 5 computers was basically a rock, if you will, and the terminology given to me by a guy's navigation control engineer was that without those five onboard space computers, basically it was a falling rock. So very complicated in terms of switches. It had around 2,500 switches. There were somewhere in the vicinity of 11 to 14 displays to provide display information to the astronauts and situational awareness. So by far, it was quite a complex machine that NASA operated. And now let's turn our attention to what we're operating right now is the space station. And, you know, obviously the space station is, let's call it the first phase of some of the, I guess for the lack of a better term, investigative research in mission exploration. So space station is what we call dependent Earth exploration, and we call that dependent Earth exploration because it's very close to Earth. It's only 250 nautical miles roughly above the Earth's surface, about 0.25 seconds delay in communications. But we're learning about the microgravity environment that provides an opportunity to conduct unique science experiments. You know, the thing about the microgravity is it basically unmasks some of the things that we don't know about because of the gravity environment or the 1G environment here on Earth. Like, for example, the absence of buoyancy and sedimentation. On Earth, you know, you have liquid, for example, water and oil that kind of separate here in the 1G environment. In the microgravity environment, they basically do not do that. And so that's an opportunity to learn about developing, let's say, new materials and new processes associated with buoyancy and sedimentation in the microgravity environment. The absence of convection, you know, you have convection here on Earth. You know, for some of you that perhaps have cooked eggs or some kind of a meal, if you will, on a stove, and you see the let's say the vapors going upward, you know, because of the that's actually attributed to the 1G environment, if you will. Well, in a microgravity environment, you have that absence of convection. That's one of the reasons why when we develop avionic systems, we have to make sure that a lot of our avionic systems are basically conduction cooled. In other words, they conduct the heat in a conduction manner and not a convection manner. Let's talk about the absence of hydrostatic pressures. So on Earth, you know, as you get further and further down into, let's say, water, for those of you who are scuba divers or have done scuba diving, you notice that as you get further down, the pressure gets higher and higher. And that's not the case in the microgravity environment. Again, it's another opportunity to unmask, if you will, some of the phenomenons that are associated with the physics of materials and processes that we can understand better in the space station environment. Containerless float. Here's a picture of Scott Kelly. That's a ball of fluid right there. So in a microgravity environment, fluid has no boundaries, if you will. It just becomes a big old ball of fluid, and it doesn't have to adhere to the container like it does here on space. And so that's something that we can take advantage of in a microgravity environment. Understanding also the technology that is going to be needed for deep space. Here's an example of I think we call it the robotics fueling mission hardware that was installed in one of the space station modules. And so this was technology to investigate what is it going to take to develop hardware or systems for storing cryogenic fuels. And of course, cryogenic fluids rather are going to be obviously vital for things for coolant, for environmental support systems, as well as refueling. So these are some of the ongoing investigations on space station. And certainly you got to have a good toilet. And this is here's a picture of an astronaut working with the onboard space station toilet. I can tell you that the space shuttle had a lot of issues with with the toilet, and we keep improving on it. But certainly, we all want, at least from a human aspect, we want a good operating toilet that doesn't back up and things of that sort. So they've been there's been an evolution process in developing better toilets, if you will, for space, for space station that could be suitable for for the moon, Mars, and beyond. And of course, here's the key one: is Scott Kelly. That you may be aware of or may not be aware of, that he was involved with a long duration mission, something in the vicinity of 340 days. That mission was to understand the psychological and physiological aspects of the human body for long duration missions. Now, this was roughly for 340 days. Of course, there was another cosmonaut that also was involved with this experiment. And they found things that are kind of a little bit, let's say, um, uh, in a way, we're a little bit cautious about working with, or rather, dealing with future astronauts that are going to be going deep into space. So, some of the things that they found from a physiological standpoint is, vascular changes. They saw, obviously changes in fluid shifts. They saw changes in some of the biological aspects of Scott Kelly compared to his twin brother. This was very interesting because this was an experiment where you had both, identical twins, Scott Kelly on the ground, or rather in space, and then his brother on Earth, and to compare what's going on with the body physiologically and psychologically. Unfortunately, I have to say that the psychological aspects, it's inconclusive at this point in time. They found things like, for example, a degradation in motor skills and things of that sort, but we still don't understand, let's say, the psychological aspects of deep space flight, at least, for 1 year. I can tell you that I had an opportunity to talk to a Russian scientist that was involved with several experiments in Siberia for, let's call them long duration missions in Siberia. And it was interesting in talking to him that he said that when the test subjects were interviewed, that, they gave kind of a debrief of some of the things that affected them, lighting, because of circadian rhythms and things of that sort. But interesting enough, he said one thing that some of the test subjects mentioned was something that was not conveyed in some of the debriefs, and that was this, that these test subjects basically mentioned that they were on Earth, that one day that door would open, they get out. And so that was the motivation for them to last that period of time in some of these long duration missions. So we still don't know what are the effects of humans for a long duration mission. And, certainly more information for space station would be beneficial. But again, some of the other factors that I have been learning over the past is, obviously we're close to Earth. Looking at Earth is obviously a big motivation for astronauts in terms of keeping them motivated, in terms of isolation. But we still don't know what's going to happen to the astronauts once they see Earth the size of a little pea, if you will, and they know that there's no door that you can open, to get back to Earth. So let's talk about the planned human spaceflight programs, and I'm kind of we'll be going through these kind of briefly, but so it's going to be a phased approach to Mars, and that's what NASA is looking at right now. We're looking at it from a phase standpoint of what we first see as a Earth-dependent mission operations, and this is basically space station, and then the moon, which is going to be the proving ground. The moon is actually, in my opinion, going to be a pivotal point in terms of understanding what it's going to really take to go beyond the moon into Mars and even beyond, let's call it settlement, if you will, of other planets. And of course, here you see Mars as the initial opportunity for what we call Earth independent missions, where Earth independent means that we're so far away from Earth that we have to depend on ourselves and the vehicles and the systems that we develop. So let me just briefly talk about deep space mission operations. So I've talked about space station. I've talked about, it's obviously near Earth orbit, about 240 nautical miles, about 2.5 second delay in communications. And, but we have a whole slew of folks supporting space station. We got Mission Control Center at the Johnson Space Center, somewhere in the vicinity of 50 mission control flight controllers, and also we have folks what we call the mission evaluation room supporting the flight controllers, and then we have the Russian space agency also supporting space stations. So we have a whole slew of folks supporting space station, and rightly so. I mean, we have somewhere in the vicinity of 350,000 sensors on space station, somewhere in the vicinity of over 100 computer systems. They have to be monitored on a 24/7 basis. We're probably looking at that kind of range of complexity for deep space missions, or maybe even more than that, for missions to Mars and beyond. And so that paradigm, it may be changing as we go deeper into space. So as we go into the proving ground, there you see a picture of kind of a notional picture, if you will, of the Artemis program in terms, and I'll say a little more about the Artemis program later, but the gateway orbiting the moon. And we're gonna have a certain amount of ISS folks, or rather mission control folks, monitoring the moon program, on the Apollo space program, because of it was about 1.3 second delay. It wasn't a big issue. So things like, for example, I think it was called the 1202 alarm that happened as Apollo 11 was getting ready to land on the moon. Neil Armstrong basically disabled the autonomous control and took over to land the Eagle on the moon. And so we have that capability on the moon. But as we start going further and further, like for example, we're looking at developing let's call it a spacecraft that's going to take us to Mars and orbit Mars. It's going to get a little bit more challenging. And so the moon, rather the mission control center that we depend on, is going to have to be more so a onboard mission control center to help the astronauts basically navigate and overcome some of the challenges that they can encounter that traditionally we depended on Mission Control Center, but I'll say some of the challenges later on about the onboard Mission Control Center in my presentation. And so we're going from a crew mission control dependent missions into a crew vehicle dependent missions as we go further into space. And so the Artemis program, which is currently our program to return to the moon since the Apollo space program. And of course, 2024, I have to say that I think that number is going to change in the next year or so. But be that as it may, it's basically we're formulating a plan, return to the moon. And it hasn't happened in a long period of time. So our first mission is going to be, to the moon in the 21st century. We're looking at actually this year is the Orion spacecraft to go to the moon with no humans on board and test out the systems for about 21 days to see how that system behaves in the radiation environment of the moon. I have to tell you that from a radiation standpoint, that the Apollo space mission systems, computer hardware systems, were a little bit different than what we're trying to send right now. And I have to say that from the standpoint of simplicity and in terms of radiation, inherently radiation hardened. A lot of the electronic systems in the Apollo space program were inherently radiation hardened. As we get more and more into the complexity of some of the systems that we're talking about returning to the moon, it's going to be more challenging in terms of handling radiation effects. And so let's now talk about Artemis 2, where we have humans basically orbit the moon in the 21st century, hopefully next year. And this is an opportunity for, for humans to spend roughly about 21 to 25 days orbiting the moon and basically checking out the systems. But now you have a human-tended vehicle that basically provides an opportunity to learn a little bit more about what's working and what's not working. In the meantime, we're also going to be looking at the first high-powered solar electric propulsion systems that are going to be critical for deep space missions. Certainly solar electric power is not going to be the only option, but at least near term, that's going to be one that we're going to be looking at. And then the support of the first pressurized module delivery to Gateway. We're going to have a Gateway system, which let's call it the equivalent of the International Space Station that we have now, but more so for the moon. And we're going to have the first pressurized module, to build, the Gateway to build the orbiting, let's call it the moon's space station. And then we're going to have a human lander systems delivered to the Gateway. Then we're going to go to a crew mission to Gateway and the lunar surface. Now we have the human lander systems. Let's look at what it's going to take to to land the human lander systems on the moon and perform operations on the moon. It's a little bit different than the Apollo space program, but again, it's the objective is to eventually have the ability for sustainment on the moon as compared to the Apollo space program. And so we're looking at, for example, SpaceX, landing crew vehicles, providing commercial lunar payload services. large-scale cargo landers, human landers, extra vehicle activities on the moon in the 21st century. And so now let's start talking about the challenges, because a lot of this that I've been talking to has been somewhat optimistic, if you will, but there are some challenges associated with going beyond Earth orbit onto the moon and even onto Mars. And so the moon I see as a proving ground for space colonization. This is an opportunity to learn from the from the space program that during the Apollo, that there are some aspects of it that we still need to refine, if you will, that we need to build on. The thing about the Apollo space program is that was our habitat right there. The lunar lander is you're looking at as well. And so it's a far cry from what you've seen as pictures of colonization on the moon. But for the Apollo space program, it was sufficient for that particular mission. And if you look at the total number of hours that we have spent on the moon, it's really not all that much. 3.4 days. You can't say that we learned a lot in 3.4 days in terms of what it takes to have a sustainment let's call it sustainability of a long duration mission on the moon. And we're talking about a proving ground. We're going to have to spend a long time on the moon to understand what is it going to take to develop that technology to go on to other planets. Again, 3.4 days is not a whole lot. Think about let's say you spend one day camping on let's say a park in your neighborhood, and then you spend 3 days there, and then all of a sudden you want to go to Mount Everest. It's a far cry, and so we have to learn a lot more about living and working on the moon. But it's our proving ground. Some of the human needs and challenges associated with deep space is obviously the gravity aspect, the physiological aspects. The balancing disorders, fluid shifts, cardiovascular deconditioning that I mentioned, muscular atrophy where your body grows, bone loss, and so it's a challenge. So you have to do countermeasures, like for example, exercise and perhaps taking certain medications. That's something that the Human Health and Performance Group at the Johnson Space Center is looking at in terms of countermeasures. Space radiation, oh my gosh, that's a biggie. Acute in-flight effects, long duration cancer risks, the cognitive aspects of the radiation effects. And of course, there's different solutions that we've been looking at for the radiation effects of the human body, and certainly for electronics too as well, which I'll mention later on. But it's not trivial. It's not trivial in terms of power, size, weight, and power. We're looking at different options right now, but it's not conclusive as to what's the best solution. Isolation confinement, as I mentioned, it's a biggie. If you look at what is the success of a mission going to another planet, and of course, you have to have good hardware, you have to have good software, but you also have the human element, and the human element is critical. You can have the best hardware, you can have the best software, but if the human element is, let's say, not up to par, if you will, and they start performing subpar, and they're not able to perform some of the tasks, and there's a lot of errors and stuff, things of that sort, the mission may not be a success. So contrary to what I have seen in some of the some of the presentations is that it goes beyond the hardware and the software. The human element is a critical and to me is one of the most important part of a human deep space mission. Hostile close environment. They got to have food. They got to have water. They got to have a good habitat. And certainly the vehicle design is going to be critical, for deep space missions. And again, distance from Earth in terms of medical emergencies associated with astronauts not feeling well, or perhaps they're injured and there's an operation that has to be performed. We're going to have those medical devices in place, to help those astronauts. Let's talk about technology and autonomy. So there's going to be different levels of autonomy. Right there you see level 1, execution mainly under real-time control, like remote or teleoperations. I have to say that, like for example, level 2, execution of pre-planned mission operations on board automation operations is kind of like the power systems. The power systems are going to have to be kind of automated. They're going to have to be under some kind of automation control. You see a picture of robotic systems, and I'll say more about this, but they're going to have either autonomous or semi-autonomous operation, for example, mining and let's say repair of a habitat. Level 3 is an execution of adaptive mission operations on board. And then level 4, full autonomous operations, where the robotic system basically is, given the command to, hey, go repair the habitat because I got a hole in the southern portion of the habitat. So the robotic systems autonomy is going to be a critical aspect of deep space missions, and it's not a trivial task. As I've been learning, I've been involved with the writing of a book called System Safety for Space Operations, and I've been involved with the robotics aspects of it, and understanding robotic systems and how they're going to operate in space. Not so much for the hardware and the software, but also the autonomy with the let's call it the human and the collaboration with the machine in order to meet the objectives of, let's say, for example, repair of a habitat. And certainly the human aspect is critical here. I have to say that if you don't have a teaming, if you don't have a good cohesion of a team for a deep space mission, that could potentially be an alert, if you will, or a hazard or a caution or a risk associated with deep space missions. We still don't know how a crew is going to operate as a team for a deep space mission. Again, habitats are going to be critical. Habitats are going to be huge. And depending on the size of them, we still don't know how to land something like a large habitat on another planet. And maybe I'll mention something later. But right now, like for example, the Mars Perseverance and the Mars Science Laboratory Curiosity was about 2,000 pounds. So the way they landed those was the limit of because of the weight of those systems. Anything above that, my understanding from some JPL colleagues is that we're going to have to come up with some new ways how to land something much larger. And because of the nature of the kinetic energy, you got a large mass. You have it coming in at a certain velocity, and so there you have to find a way to bleed off that kinetic energy, to land these kind of large systems on another planet in a safe manner. And of course, communications, the communications aspect of it, and not so much, maybe for example, mission control, to the Mars or or the moon in terms of understanding what's going on. But we have to find a way of perhaps increasing the communication link, if you will, so that way we can increase the opportunity for other technology that'll benefit astronauts, like for example telepresence, dealing with their loved ones. Again, going back to the isolation aspects of astronauts and dealing with deep space operations and missing their loved ones. It's obviously something that I have seen and read in some of the writings that astronauts have found, connection with loved ones as keeping them motivated in terms of a mission is concerned. The digital twin. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the digital twin. This is a big thing with the automotive industry, oil and gas industry. To some extent, NASA has been involved with the digital twin. If you think about Apollo 13, that when we had those, when we had that accident, they had a system on the ground that basically emulated what was going on with the Apollo 13. And so that's basically the digital twin. But as we go further into space, the amount of information necessary to support a digital twin is going to be critical. And there's another aspect of this, and that has to do with training. So we're going to be training for a certain, let's say, a certain mission going to the moon and Mars, but that's not necessarily what's going to happen in reality. And so how do we update our models to reflect what's really going on based on what we did on the ground? And so the digital twin is an opportunity to upgrade our models. But again, because of the communications in terms of the bit rate and things of that sort is a major challenge. But it's going to be certainly necessary, in order to increase the fidelity of our systems. And I just mentioned this about entry, landing, and descent. We understand how to land something less than 2,000 pounds, but we don't really understand how to land something beyond 2,000 pounds. And of course, medical facilities, it's going to be a necessary for, for a deep space mission. Unfortunately, a lot of the medical devices, MRIs or CAT scans and things of that sort, they were not designed for a radiation environment. So we're going to have to figure out a way how to develop those kind of systems for the radiation environment of deep space. This is a kind of a prototype. What you're looking at there is a prototype of a in situ resource utilization, which is going to be obviously critical for deep space missions. In situ resource utilization is basically the technology of converting, let's say, the moon or Mars soil into resources that are beneficial for humans, like, for example, extracting water or creating fuel. This is low technology stuff. This is what we call low technology readiness level, somewhere in the vicinity of TR level 3, which is basically kind of research stuff, where TR level 9 is the maximum technology readiness level, which basically says this is, let's call it, for the lack of a better term, flight proven system. So we are a long way from some of that technology. Same thing with mining and habitat. We're going to be doing mining. We're going to be doing things, for extracting stuff from the moon. Well, guess what? There's things like, for example, the moon soil, regolo, is very abrasive. So we have to deal with that, because that moon abrasiveness can affect gears and things of that sort for things that are drilling and operating in the moon environment. The conduction rate equation that I show there is associated with, depending on where we're going to have this equipment, is it can be very cold on the moon and it can be very hot. And so the deviations in those temperatures, can affect the operation of the systems. I think it's not advertised, but the moon still gets hit by asteroids or meteoroids, and so we have to design our systems, to handle perhaps impact of meteorites on the moon. And of course, the microgravity environment. Okay, so you got a large vehicle that, let's say, for example, is going to be drilling on the Earth, but on the Earth, on a 1G environment, obviously it's heavy enough that it doesn't give in terms of when it's digging down into the ground and trying to extract soil. It's an action reaction. So you got to have enough weight in order for it, to grab a bunch of dirt and drill it out. But if the microgravity environment is causing it not to basically drill as it should on the ground, that's going to be a major challenge. So how do we, let's say, take this equipment and perhaps maybe drill some staking devices, to hold it down while it's drilling. So that's another major challenge as well. There's earthquakes or rather moonquakes on the Earth, and we have to be cautious of that. We don't want to build a habitat where lunar quakes occur. And then, this is the lunar module that just basically says that was a 400-pound module that we landed on the moon. Anything bigger than that, we have to start thinking about how we're going to do that. And of course, the radiation environment, not just the humans, but the electronics as well. And so let's talk about the deep space electronics, the computing power and the galactic radiation. If we give an example of a ground cloud computing system, we have, like for the IBM Watson, the Alexis, or the Google search engine, you got these large rooms full of, let's call servers. Each server has a lot of high computational power that basically, produces some of the, let's say, the features that we have that we take advantage of on our iPhones. But in deep space, because of the radiation environment, we have to factor in the radiation effects of some of these electronics. And so we got to design, build, test, or maybe even buy electronic components that can handle that deep space environment. And it's not cheap. Some of these boards run somewhere in the vicinity of $275,000 compared to a, let's call it a desktop board that maybe just run you $300. And so our, let's call it our servers in deep space are not going to be that big. And so that's one of our challenges in terms of, let's call it artificial intelligence. I mentioned earlier about mission control centers, that basically the mission control center is going to be emulated for a onboard mission control center in terms of AI, machine learning. How are we going to do that if we have these radiation effect limits on electronics? And it's not trivial. Even some of the commercial components that can survive electronics can, to a certain point, in terms of single event upsets. So we can handle bit flips and things of that sort. But what's happening over time is that radiation starts to affect the lattice structure of silicon components and starts deforming them. That deformation starts to affect the performance of electronics. And so how do we handle that in the long term? And so, by the way, what crewed traits should a deep space mission have? You have somebody like, this is a picture of Sir Ernest Shackleton, which was a polar explorer back in the 1900s. And he was basically, he was credited for the first successful failed mission of a polar mission. And so I have to tell you, if you have the opportunity to read the book Shackleton, let's call it Shackleton's Way, It talks about the story of being stranded for 2.5 years on a South Pole with 28 men, but he brought them all back home safely. And the story goes as to the leadership of Sir Ernest Shackleton bringing them back safely. So is that something that we need for a moon, or even a Mars mission, where things can go wrong? And also, let's talk about MacGyver. If you're familiar with MacGyver, MacGyver could take a needle, a rubber band, chewing gum, and things of that sort, and come up with a solution. We're going to need that, for future space missions. So, how do we select a crew for a deep space mission in terms of dealing with the unexpected? You have somebody like your Sir Ernest Shackleton from a leadership standpoint, but you also have folks like MacGyver that are able to come up with solutions based on what's available on that mission. We don't know everything that's going to happen on a deep space mission. And so let me just kind of briefly talk about the systems engineering process. I'm just going to kind of highlight this, but the systems engineering process is what NASA does. And so what we do is that we methodically develop systems using systems engineering process, very similar to, let's call it the scientific method, which is basically make an observation, design an experiment, do the experiment, gather the data, and compare it against a hypothesis, and see where you have to do a refinement. But it's just not the hardware, but it's also the human element, and this is where the human-centered design, human systems integration comes into play. Again, it's just not the human, but it's also the human, what the human interfaces with, which is the hardware and the software. And so we got also the technical management processes, the planning in terms of requirements management, interface management, risk management, configuration management, technical assessment. Are we going in the right track? What do we have to do differently? Are we maturing the technology at the right rate? What do we need to do to mature the technology to get us to the moon, Mars, and beyond? Decision analysis. How are we going to decide what's the best approach in terms of architecture, in terms of hardware, in terms of software? And this is part of the technical management processes. And so the requirements development processes, trade studies, human in the loop test evaluation, architecture, prototyping. Oh my gosh, prototyping is going to be a huge thing for the moon, Mars, and beyond. Test and evaluation also as well. How are we going to evaluate these systems in terms of what we are doing here on Earth, but how are we going to do that on the moon and Mars, and more so going back to the what I call the digital twin is going to be critical as well. And of course, the fundamental design, fabrication, and test of the systems, the integration of the systems, the incremental assembly, the incremental test of the systems, subsystem testing, system testing as well, and then transition to the next level. This is not all trivial, but this is obviously critical to the whole aspect of developing systems for deep space missions and beyond. And all through this process is the managing the risk throughout the life cycle. And keeping with the habitat architecture considerations is there's two key aspects of it that I see is the keeping the humans alive when occupied, and also keep it operational when not occupied by the humans. And right there, you're seeing the habitat and the different aspects of it, the maintenance, the logistics, the repurposed facility, the avionics, the environmental life support systems, power, structures, hygiene, human-computer interfaces, robotic systems, food and water systems are going to be critical, for development of the systems for the moon, Mars, and beyond. designed for the environment, not trivial, not rather very expensive. You know, we're talking about radiation. That's a huge thing. Somewhere around $60,000 for the testing aboard. You know, for 1 week at the Brookhaven radiation test facility in New Jersey. Leak, depress, repress, vibration of the systems, electromagnetics. Oh my gosh, electromagnetics is a huge aspect in terms of system development as well as reliability, pressure, thermal effects as well. Watch out for the errors and the failures. Human systems integration system view you see there is not just the environment and the hardware and the software, but it's the human. The hardware, you know, you have what we call the bathtub curve here, which basically says that early on you have infant mortality, but once that infant mortality has been overcome, then you have a constant failure rate that you can compute how long your hardware is going to last before the wear out starts to occur. It's not the same with software. Software has a somewhat of a sawtooth failure rate in terms of you develop some software, but you have a lot of errors, and then you're trying to mitigate those errors, and then you've gone to a minimum point of a failure rate, but then you do upgrades, and then you're going to be continuously reducing those failure rates over time. This is what I see for future space missions. We're going to have to update our hardware software systems and once we go beyond Earth and beyond, because we're not going to be able to test everything here on Earth. And also the human error aspect of it. I'll just say that there's two aspects for the human error. The skill-based human error that's associated with basically you understand the system, but you've made mistakes. And then there's the mistake human error, which is this is new systems. I'm learning it, but I'm making mistakes and I need to correct them as we go along. So there's two aspects of the human error that we're going to have to also address in human development. And then safety in the switch model. Designers understand hardware and software, not the humans. We need to engage early. We cannot redesign the human to fit the system. That's not going to work. We have to make sure the system is adapted to the human and build a system right, making sure that we design the system from the onset correctly. And here's the Swiss cheese model that just basically conveys that there are many barriers that we at NASA and maybe other programs as well are involved with in order to mitigate risk. And so what you see here, rather than a square cheese model, is a circular Swiss cheese model because it's happening, changing over time. Excuse me. And so you got requirements, you got design, you got safety, training, maintenance, and crew systems. And these are the barriers to try to prevent a hazard from creating an accident. And for the most part, you will. But keep in mind that we're human and we have errors, and that's what these holes mean. These are representative weaknesses in the barriers, and there'll be a time where things line up just properly in day and time that a particular hazard will basically go on through to create an accident. That's part of systems engineering. That's part of human systems integration. That's why we test a lot. That's why it's expensive in the human spaceflight program. And then the major challenges is to improve training is the digital twin, as I mentioned. We're going to have a system on Earth that's going to basically look at Mars or maybe the moon, and we're going to maybe have the human, and we're going to have this information being transferred back and forth, you know, to update the models. That's the only way we're going to learn how well we've done systems. What do we need to do to build systems in the future? And then the conclusion. So path to the future is to live and learn and work on other worlds and settle in other worlds. And then one day go on to other worlds. as Captain Picard said, engage. All right. So with that, let's see. That concludes my presentation, and let me hopefully let's see. Hopefully, I can return control. Maybe I have control. Sharing with you folks.
Yep, we're good. So everybody, if you have a question, just go ahead and put your hand up, and I'll call on you just to kind of remind you how to do that. At the bottom of your screen, you have this little reactions icon. Just click on the little raise hand, and then I'll call on you in the order that I see. So let's see. Looks like we have 3 people with their hands up. We have Alex, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a fantastic presentation. It's very well said and put together, George. And I want not only thank you, but also say that it will go to tomorrow to Monaco, to France, to Cyprus, and to Spain for new space doctors to learn from this presentation. So, and my question is that we should be getting feedback, and I actually have some answers now for several questions that you asked, like how to select people, how to train them, what things are new. But I don't want to put it here because it will be a long discussion. So I think we'll be collecting feedback, and I send it to Nathan, and it looks like it can be ongoing discussion. So, but your presentation was just fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, sounds good. And we have Manu, you have a question. You want to go ahead and ask it? Oh, it looks like you're still on mute, Manu.
How do robots rotate on the planet?
How do robots rotate on the planet? You mean like how they maneuver around, like the Mars Perseverance or something on the moon? Is
Like in Mars or Moon or planet Earth?
Okay. So the question is, how do robots maneuver around in space?
How they maneuver around space?
Okay.
Well,
My
I guess
apologies.
just to maybe adapt that question a little bit, George, whenever looking at how systems maneuver around on, say, the moon and Mars, you know, we talked a little bit about that whenever Greg gave some of the news update, but I was wondering if maybe you could talk about some of the differences in the way those systems have to be adapted and tested and planned for and that type of thing.
Yeah, that's a good question because that goes back to let's call autonomy or automation. And so some systems are robotic systems. Maybe let's say different levels of autonomy where you have anywhere from level 1, which is kind of telerobotics, near real time. Where you're getting feedback from operating a robotic system, let's say, for example, drilling operations. And so you're seeing what's going on. You're looking at the telemetry coming back from a robotic system, and you're getting that feedback, and so you're adjusting, let's say the drilling, digging, and things of that sort. All the way to fully autonomous systems, where basically, for the lack of simplicity, you press a button and say, "Okay, okay, robot, go drill here, and just give me the status of how you're operating. How you're dealing with with the drilling operations. So, that's something that we're going to have to deal with in terms of verification and validation, those kind of systems when we're doing our testing here on the ground. But certainly a challenge, if you will, and somewhat of a um, um, challenge that we like as engineers in terms of verification and validation. But the whole aspect of verification and validation for robotic missions, or rather robotic operations, is a major challenge. If hopefully I answered that question.
Yeah, thank you, Manu. Does that help to address a little bit of the of your question?
That sounds, it'd be nice to like travel around.
Yeah, it would be. I think we have a lot to learn in terms of moving around on other worlds. Definitely. I mean, like George said, I think we've only spent, what was it, 3 days outside on the surface of the moon, and then this is the first time we're flying a helicopter in the atmosphere of Mars, and it's going to be a lot of learning that we have to do.
Good.
Well, I see we have Gary. You also have your hand up. What's your question?
Sure, yeah, thank you. Couple questions on the human landing system. First, there is or was a trade associated with gateway versus no gateway. I'm wondering where that stands. Is it a settled issue now? Going straight there versus stopping at a gateway first. Second question was, as far as surface time, you mentioned it's been very short so far. What do you see in terms of surface times now, in terms of the mission duration for the human landing system going forward?
All right, good questions, Gary. In terms of gateway, I think at this point in time, the approach is to have a gateway, an orbiting, let's call it an orbiting space station, and from there we conduct whether it's remote operations from the gateway, or once human lander systems come into play in the gateway, is that we basically deorbit the human lander systems on the moon, and perform sorties, if you will, on the moon. As far as the duration is concerned, that is going to be somewhat of a challenge. Certainly one of the things that at least in the mission safety world look at is how long doing extravehicle activities are going to be performed, because the longer that you have a extravehicle activity, the more likelihood of things going wrong. And one thing that's not advertised is the extravehicle activity suits have been designed to handle a puncture of a let's call it a micrometeorite or things of that sort, of the size of a BB, for about 30 minutes. And so, you start, losing air and things of that sort. Luckily, we have not had that issue, but that's certainly in the back of the minds, during extra vehicle activity. So if you've ever heard that, NASA frowns upon doing a long duration extra vehicle activity, it's because, the longer you have them out there, the longer there's a likelihood of something going wrong in terms of compromising the astronauts' health. And so that's going to be dependent, and that's where robotic systems come into play. How much of the robotic systems can we leverage, to do a lot of this work that's going to be needed for surface systems, for building habitats, for drilling, for mining, things of that sort. And so that's going to have to be a ongoing discussion in terms of what's going to take. But I can tell you that in terms of let's say who's going to do what, we rather have the machines do a lot of the work rather than humans.
Thank you.
Sounds good.
Okay.
I see Tyler, you have your hand up.
Howdy, I enjoyed the talk, and I have a question specifically regarding human health response to low but not microgravity. And I've heard a lot of discussion of this, but are there any like officially planned or missions that like appear like they're like on their way to being planned for building some kind of either like very simple rotating, maybe tethered habitat, or something in low Earth orbit where we could test like 0.1 G like the moon, or like 0.3 something G like Mars?
Yeah. The whole issue of dealing with microgravity and creating an artificial gravity, has been actually a discussion, obviously for many years. One of the things that I've learned over the years and talking to gentlemen that have been involved with human habitability and performance is the challenge of building a structure that can rotate at a certain rate that doesn't cause the human to let's say deal with seasickness, or let's call it space sickness, if you will, of the rotation aspect of it, but at the same time building something that's not so large that makes it somewhat challenging to build. And so I've seen some of the designs that I have seen are rather large, and so anything large and rotating in the space environment can be challenging if you think about how you're going to verify that here on Earth, because we have the 1G environment. And so that's one of the major challenges, is taking something that's something like one of the rotating structures that I saw, I think was somewhere in the vicinity of 430 yards long or something like that, and a rotating arm. And so how do you do something like that here on Earth? Certainly that's something that I think we need a little bit more work, as far as investigative work is, if you will. We don't have right now. We don't have funding for that, but certainly that's one of the let's call it the technology areas that we need to address. But that's a great question.
David, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, George. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on some of the new initiatives with involving public-private partnerships and having commercial collaborators with NASA and commercial means of doing things with not only NASA but other potentially other customers in mind, and just kind of how you're seeing that all coming along.
Yeah, good question, David. Being that I've been involved with the SpaceX, with commercial crew program, I've seen firsthand, how the let's call it the commercial space program handles, let's call it the design, development, and test. And so they're more of an agile type system as opposed to NASA, I have to say. I think it certainly would be beneficial in terms of let's call it reducing the time of development. SpaceX has a build a little, test a little, build a little, test a little. Obviously, you've seen that perhaps in the Starship explosions that have happened over the last few months. But they keep learning. They keep learning and I don't want to call them failures. I call them setbacks. Failures when you stop trying. Setback is when you've had an issue, you identify it, you look at what were the shortcomings, and then you include that into your next revision and then upgrade it. And so that's the way SpaceX does. And I think the commercial crew, I think, brings to the table a new paradigm in terms of developing systems. So I have to say that the marriage, if you will, of the NASA philosophy of developing deep space missions. And certainly, I think NASA, what brings to the table is the human spaceflight aspect of it. We got years of experience of dealing with the human spaceflight. The limitations, the capabilities of the human and the human machine interface. I think we bring that to the table. But I think what the commercial crew brings in, commercial program brings to the table is the agile development of systems that I think collectively will help us perhaps shorten the time frame, to going to the moon, developing the technologies that are necessary for going on to the Mars and beyond.
Sounds good. I definitely like that about failures when you stop trying, everything else is a setback. So that's a good life lesson there. Tyler, you have a question? It looks like it's muted still.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So, and sort of playing off of David's question. So how much technology and information is being shared, as far as you understand, between like NASA and private entities as well, compared to maybe between what you would find between like two different space agencies and maybe even between two different private actors?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so one of the interesting challenges, and it's a good question actually, Tyler, is that in the commercial space sector, they are in the business of making money, and so the anything that they come up with is they try to keep that as secret as possible. I have to say that the dealing with the commercial companies that I've been working with so far is you have to keep these firewalls, if you will, in terms of information. However, SpaceX and certainly Boeing are always receptive to working collaboratively with NASA in trying to come up with a solution. So in terms of information exchange, I think it's been very open for the most part, but also at the same time keeping it secretive, if you will, in terms of not getting it out. At this point in time, because of the nature of some of the proposals and contracts that are on the table in terms of human lander systems, gateway systems, and things of that sort, a lot of things are secretive. But once those things, I think, once they open up, there's going to be obviously a little bit more, let's call open collaboration into making, to meeting the objectives and goals of what the proposal was all intended for, whether it's a human lander system, the in situ resource utilization, mining of the moon, or whatever that is, but I guess we have to be mindful of the commercial entities that they're trying to make money, and so it's a far cry from the government, which our objective is to spend money versus the commercial to make money. So
Sounds good. I see, David, you have a question.
Yeah, maybe a follow-up on that, George, with the commercial interests in being able to make money, and then looking at some things historically that have happened with standards and interoperability and so forth. Like, for example, with computers and the open architectures for like the PCI cards and hard drives and so forth, where anybody could make parts that would work in pretty much any other chassis, or even in airlines, where the avionics in the cockpit would be interchangeable. It could be made by any company and work in any airframe. What are you seeing any effort in really trying to get interoperability and standards happening?
Oh, absolutely. You know, there's a standard called the uh, integrated modular avionics, which basically you can house different levels of criticality of software in a computer system, and basically provide this firewall, if you will, between different criticalities of the system. And you know, that's a standard. You know, the standard of time triggered Ethernet, which is just recently a new one, a fairly new one in terms of communications protocols. And so there's a whole there's quite a few different standards out there. You know, right now our group at the Johnson Space Center is looking at standards associated with graphics processing units in terms of how can we leverage some of the commercial products that are associated with graphics processing to develop a radiation tolerant or radiation hardened graphics processor. At this point in time, there are no graphics processors that can survive the deep space radiation environment. And so what we're looking at is how can we leverage some of the open architectures in terms of ARM processors, in terms of graphics processing, and so how do we marriage those together to come up with a product that would be beneficial and suitable for the deep space environment. So yeah, the whole aspect of open architectures and some of the commercial systems, COT systems as we call them, are of great interest for NASA, and that's something we're looking at as well.
There's a few people that have put some questions in the chat, so I think I'll just call on them and have them ask their questions. So
Sure.
John, you had a couple of questions you wanted to ask. Could you unmute? Yeah,
Okay, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, I had a couple of follow-up questions based on some of the other questions. Someone asked if the gateway was a goal, and it is. I guess Rocket Labs is going to design a craft to follow the NRO, the near rectilinear orbit, and confirm it for the gateway. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question, John?
All right. Prior to launching the gateway, we need an orbit. There was a study done of 7 halo orbits, and the NRO was selected, the near rectilinear orbit. And so now we need a vendor to go out to build a craft to go and confirm that, to follow along the orbit and take measurements, correct?
Uh-huh.
So, you know, so that the gateway will function properly and meet all its specifications.
Okay, so your question is about the orbit of the gateway? Is that
Oh, no, we know what the orbit is, but we needed a robot to follow along the NRO and confirm that it will actually meet the specifications, you know, like solar and communications and all that for the gateway.
Okay, yeah. So I'll have to I'll have to fess up that I'm not familiar with the guidance and navigation and control of the gateway. Right now, I have been involved more so with the insides of the gateway, if you will. So I'll have to play ignorant to the aspects of the guidance, navigation, and control aspects of it. But it's my understanding that the gateway is to provide along with some other assets, and I'm not sure what the other assets mean, other than perhaps other communications, is to provide 24-hour continuous communications with the ground systems once we start doing surface system sorties.
I was just going to add, I had seen some reference to that. You mentioned Rocket Labs. I think that is one of the missions for late this year or possibly early next year, is to send a small craft up into that same orbit, that near rectilinear halo orbit. I believe that is part of the current NASA plan.
Okay. My second question was on medical concerns. Do you know Dr. Charles at Johnson Space Center? He did the twin study with the Kelly brothers.
Oh gosh, actually, there's something somewhere around 15 people that were involved with that twin study. I suspect that he was one of them. There is a report out on that twin study, quite elaborate. But I don't particularly know that gentleman. I suspect that I probably came across him at one time or another.
My question was, that study was done in weightlessness of space, microgravity. But on the moon, of course, our gravity is about 18% of the Earth. My question is, and you may not know this, how much of the conclusions of that twin study are reflective or applicable to, with a gravity of 18%? Certainly that would favor the humans a little better.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so my understanding, at least, dealing with my human factors engineering colleagues in the human habitability directorate, is that, this is one data point. Certainly you can, appreciate that it's just one digital twin study, and we may not have a digital twin study for a long period of time until we get, more, let's say, digital, rather twin, identical twin astronauts, and as you know, that's few and far between. And so this study, just kind of showed what the behavior was, at least physiologically and psychologically, of Scott Kelly, and comparing that against his brother. But it's not to say that it's going to be the same across, all different people. And that's the thing, is that, obviously we need more data points, to ascertain what are the effects of long duration missions. And again, this was about a 1 year mission, and going to Mars is going to be 3 years. And so, they just basically did about a third of what's really going to happen to a Mars mission, and even going beyond Mars. And so, we still, I think, for the most part, have a ways to go in understanding what the human aspects are of a long duration mission. In terms of physiological and more so psychological. Again, as I mentioned in my presentation, what the Russian scientists told me was that the test subjects that were in Siberia, they knew they were on Earth, and that door was going to open one day. That's not the case going to the moon, Mars, and beyond. That there is no door. You just see Earth as a tiny little dot. So how does that affect humans? We're not sure of.
Well, I want to thank you. You're one of the first persons that talked about moonquakes and galactic radiation. I mean, what it's going to be like or expected to be like on lunar missions, for whatever period of time. I want to thank you. You're the first that spoke about it.
Okay, thank you.
I see we have a couple more people in the room, and I think Fred is trying to ask a question too. So I think we'll take care of those three, and then we'll wrap it up if that's okay. So Ben, I see you had a question or comments regarding TDRS and GPS. Maybe Ben stepped away. Robin, I see you had a question about the biggest barrier shooting with the Swiss cheese model and the planning for accuracy. Maybe you could ask that question. Oh, you're on mute.
Yes. Mr. Salazar, what is the biggest barrier to troubleshooting with the Swiss cheese model in planning for accurate missions in space?
Oh, good question, Robin. So, the Swiss cheese model basically is a representation of, I guess, to me, it's to bring an awareness to the designers and the human factors folks. What need to be looking at. And so it's, to me, it's a opportunity to let's say fine tune our what we call human in the loop testing. And so human in the loop testing is associated with basically having a high fidelity system that that the astronaut is going to be used, put the astronaut in that environment and start testing of it. Now, so here's the drawback about that. And the military, and I just came back from a conference just last week associated with, with the military in terms of in training. And so they basically have the same issue that we have, and that is our training environment is not really realistic of what goes on. So if you think about, let's say, for example, and let me go back to the military. The military says, okay, we train our war fighters, our soldiers, in this situation. And so, but what's missing is the actual tension, the stress of bombs going off, being shot at, and my apologies for this, seeing the bloods and guts, the smell of blood, and all that kind of stuff that basically gets the adrenaline going in the human. And so when you're testing in a let's call it a benign environment, it's not realistic of what you're really going to encounter. And so sometimes we can miss some of the let's call them the holes that are in the system because of how we test. And so one of the major challenges I see, and I've been conveying this to my colleagues at the Johnson Space Center for testing, is to make our testing a little bit more realistic, so that way we can flesh out a lot of these holes associated with some of the barriers that we have. Again, we're human, we're fallible, we can't design for every possibility, and we make mistakes. And so we have to find a way to let's say identify or flesh out some of those shortcomings, if you will, as we're designing these systems. And so, the major challenge is to how do we design more realistic training systems for future astronauts on other worlds, because we've never gone to other worlds other than the moon, and we've only been there for a few days, so we have a long way to go.
Thanks.
And Fred, I love the Occupy Mars shirt. Definitely great. But I was noticing you came off of mute. I didn't know if you had a question, perhaps.
Well, I don't know if it's a question more than a comment. Tell Mr. Salazar hi for the first time. Looking forward to seeing him. And I had been talking to him some time back about long-term radiation effects on human spaceflight. Whether or not the nanotechnology is being used to sort of layer down materials to limit them, like filter radiation before it can get inside a module or even for the suits themselves. If there's anything being done on that idea.
Yeah, we're looking at different options in terms of radiation effects. And one of the things that I've been looking at has been, and I kind of went through it briefly in my presentation, but I called it the let's call it the recycling lab, if you will, on another planet. So in other words, basically, we take material that we used it for a certain application, and then we no longer need that item or whatever. We put it into this bin, and we recycle it, and then we use 3D printing to create something new. Well, it turns out that some of the materials that have been created for 3D printing have been affected. At least some of the early studies show radiation affects that material. and can degrade it and basically render it somewhat useless after a period of time. And so the whole aspect of materials, it kind of opens up a whole new aspect of the radiation effects of not just electronics, because electronics, because usually electronics are made out of silicon. And so, silicon has a certain crystal lattice structure, and radiation can distort that radiation structure. But materials, ABS and polyurethanes and all this kind of stuff also have a structure that are affected by radiation. And we're still learning, and we still don't know what those effects are over a period of time. And so that's a kind of opens up a new, to me, a can of worms in terms of understanding, materials for long duration, not so much for short duration, but long duration missions.
Thank you.
And we're running a little bit over. Ben says that he's in a place that he really can't talk in audio, so I'll just read his question to you, and then we'll wrap it up after that. So
Sure.
Ben was wondering if you could talk about any type of infrastructure that you know of to support these types of missions in terms of TDRS types of satellite GPS equivalent space weather to support like Moon and Mars missions. What might be going on there?
Yeah, excellent question. That's the whole thing, is that, these kind of missions are going to require an infrastructure that basically will, support, for the long haul, if you will, these kind of missions. So we're looking at it, let's look at it from the standpoint of refueling, okay? So, we're going to have refueling stations that are located in certain points in time, points in space, especially if we're going to go beyond Mars. Okay, and so that aspect of it is going to be a challenge in itself. Is how do we let's call it deal with long duration refueling systems? We've been looking at cryogenic systems that basically try to retain cryogenic fuel. Not necessarily for vehicles, but also for environmental life support systems that don't bleed off because of the vacuum of space. And so that whole aspect of let's call it refueling, that's adding more environmental life support system fuel, to these systems is going to be important. Now, from a transportation, rather from a communication standpoint, we're looking at a, for the lack of a better term, a deep space internet system. Okay, and that's going to be important, not just for Mars, but also beyond. So we need an internet system that not only communicates with Mars, but also provides a communication network that basically gets information back to the Earth in a timely fashion, that hopefully we can support things like telepresence and other communications that are going to be necessary to keep the astronauts healthy. And certainly the bit rate is a major challenge, I have to say, for this kind of networks. Right now we have the best we can do is somewhere in the vicinity of 10 to 30 gigabits per second. They've been talking about laser communications that can increase that tenfold. But still, if you think about telepresence and some of the aspects for keeping humans healthy, we're going to have to make that 100-fold, and I'm not sure how we're going to do that at this point in time, but certainly a challenge. And hopefully folks out there in the National Space Society will come up with a solution for that.
Well, that would be great, but at least hopefully inspire somebody else to get into that field and solve it. Well, George, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today. It's amazing all the different kind of what's involved in sending people beyond Earth and the work that's been done and that's being planned for. And I really appreciate you coming out here and sharing that with us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, for being a speaker.
Awesome. And just one last note before we kind of wrap up here. Our next meeting is going to be on May 1st, which is the first Saturday of the month at 2 p.m. And it's going to be an overview of China's space program. Ben from the Minneapolis Space Society will be presenting that. So looking forward to having that. Well, very well. I'll go ahead and stop the recording and we'll just go ahead and close this line.